Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Global Issues on Alhikmat TV 24/7 online. Today we have on our show no less a person, well-known person seen on NBC, ABC, CBS, etc. She is Dr. Laura. Welcome to the show, Dr. Laura.
Thank you.
Dr. Laura, for viewers out there, Dr. Laura is a licensed mental health counselor, and she is the president and the founder of Dr. Laura's Counseling. She's also a board certified expert in traumatic stress. So stay tuned as we discuss some of these areas around violence, domestic violence, sexual violence, COVID, how it affects people in the world, etc. So once more, Dr. Laura, it's really a pleasure to have you on Alhikmat TV.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Good, good. So maybe the first thing I would like to ask you a little bit about yourself, your background, where you're from originally.
Well, I grew up in Cape Cod in Massachusetts,
Mm-hmm.
and I lived there till I was in my 20s. I then moved to Worcester, Massachusetts, where I finished my bachelor's degree and have been in Florida for more than 30 years.
Wow, that is interesting. So, what motivated you to get into this field, to become a specialist in this field, an expert in traumatic stress, and to open your own business on counseling, etc.?
Well, I spent much of my career working at not-for-profits, but when I was 27 years old, I left an abusive relationship with two suitcases and $175 and started my life over. And
Interesting.
that really fueled the passion for using my pain to help other people.
Hmm.
I call it giving purpose to the pain and really, taking that passion that I have for being able to move out of an abusive or toxic or unhealthy situation, do some healing and moving into a healthier one. I can say I'm very blessed to be in a 25-year relationship, 23 years married, to a man that I'm still passionately in love with, and he's my best friend, and I like him more now than when I met him almost 25 years ago.
I like that. So, you are a living example of your profession and career.
I hope so. I just feel very blessed.
Hmm, that is interesting. Um, Anything else you'd like to let our viewers worldwide know about your background, your career, whatever you would like to share with our viewers about your career and your profession, etc.?
Well, I tend to be a little non-traditional in my style. I'm not real fond of labels, diagnosis. A lot of times I think, in the mental health profession, people spend more time, diagnosing the person and not looking at the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the problems and struggles people have are more situational, that either they don't feel safe telling, helping professionals what's really going on. So they're being diagnosed and oftentimes judged for situations or symptoms without knowing the whole story. And I think as mental health professionals, we have to do a better job making it safe for people to really talk about what's going on.
When you say that you're an expert in traumatic stress, would you like to let our viewers, because of the fact that with social media nowadays, yeah, we got viewers all over the world, different countries, different places, different mentality, and sometimes they may not understand what exactly you do when we talk about traumatic stress.
Well,
And the reason
traumatic
why I asked that question is that somebody may be going through that and they'll have no clue. They don't even know they're going through traumatic stress.
Well, a lot of times we all know what stress feels like. We've all been there, done that, and gotten the t-shirt. But traumatic stress is a little bit different because it's the stress and anxiety and symptoms after having gone through a traumatic situation, life-threatening or perceived life-threatening situation, a situation where somebody feels helpless in making it stop or have happened, something very often that they didn't see coming. And it's beyond the scope of what should be, when I say normal, in the everyday life experience. Unfortunately, trauma is becoming more common than not, but that doesn't make its symptoms any less significant.
Right. The reason why I ask that is because a lot of times people may think when we talk about trauma and traumatic stress, we're talking about some shootout, some accident or something of that sort, some tragedy in flying, or whatever it may be. And people at home may have their own sort of stress in that category, but may just ignore it. Is that a fact? Does that happen regularly?
Well, I don't know that they can ignore the stress. I think they can sometimes ignore getting help for it. I think a lot of times it's not really ignoring it. It's more fear of being labeled, fear of being broken or damaged, or that somebody's going to tell them that they're crazy, because the symptoms after a trauma can be very, very frightening. A lot of times there are nightmares and what we call flashbacks that are like little clips almost from a movie, where a lot of times people think they're having audio or visual hallucinations, but they're not. They're just little clips and memories that just trigger up. A trigger is the thing that sets that memory off. It can be olfactory, which is a smell. You can smell maybe a cologne that somebody wore during a trauma. Or if the trauma was fire related, maybe you smell a fire, and that triggers that time. Very often people that were over in war will hear a helicopter and it'll trigger feelings of being in rice paddies. There are a lot of things, and sometimes people can identify the triggers, but sometimes they can't. And a lot of times these triggers and flashbacks and symptoms seemingly come from out of nowhere and can be very frightening, and people are afraid that they're going crazy.
That is interesting. So that brings me to the point of COVID-19. People who have lost loved ones, or people who have been through this fear of having COVID, how do you explain the stress, and what would you recommend for people who are going through that stress of COVID, losing loved ones, themselves, experiencing it? What would you share with our viewers pertaining to that?
Well, I think when anybody loses somebody that they love, they experience grief. I mean, unfortunately, grief is the cost of love. So we have grief, but then we also have traumatic grief, where the grief is caused by a trauma, and not only the quick and traumatic death, but people that have lost loved ones due to COVID aren't only dealing with the loss and the grief, they're dealing with not having been able to say goodbye, the feeling that their loved one died alone, that they couldn't be there, that they couldn't hold their hand, that they never got a chance to say goodbye. A lot of times partners and sometimes other family members are struggling with what we call survivor's guilt, that why, we were all exposed, why did this person die and I didn't, or I didn't even get symptoms? So the ripple effect is much bigger than just, oh, we're dealing with grief, or, oh, we're afraid of COVID. There are many different layers to the grief-related struggles that people are dealing with.
That brings me to another question. What would you tell people who are going through that? How should they handle that situation? What should they do?
Well, I'm not a big believer in the word should. I call it, with all due respect, I call it almost that people should all over themselves, and
Yes.
that we shouldn't should, because there is no should. Whatever feels right for that person, that's what needs to be done. People grieve in different ways. One of the things that I've seen so many times is people feeling guilty or saying, I'm a horrible person. This person died and I didn't cry. Well, that doesn't mean that you didn't love them. People grieve in different ways in different times. Sometimes they're just completely shut down and they can't feel it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a certain way that people think that they should behave, but you have to do it your own way in your own time. Very often people hold on, and then 2, 3, 4 weeks later, 6 weeks later, we'll watch a movie where somebody dies, and all that grief that's been stuffed will come up, and that's okay. I think it's important to let it be what it is. The only thing that I think is very important is the only thing that's worse than grieving is not grieving. And a lot of times, grieving is painful and people don't want to feel it. And so they do whatever they can to not feel it. But again, grief is the cost of love, and we need to feel it and process it, because the only way to get through pain is to actually go through it. You can't put it in a box, and time isn't going to heal it by itself. A lot of times, after a traumatic event or a death, people say all the time to loved ones and friends, well, it's been 5 years, it's been 10 years, you need to just get over it. But you don't get over things unless you've gone through them. You have to process it, and grief doesn't go away on its own. So I think people need to allow themselves to feel it, and I think they need to be very careful of not feeling it. Especially, one of the things that I've seen really escalate during COVID is the day drinking and the day drugging and the self-medication of dealing with grief, and homeschooling and not working and all the changes and the stress related to COVID. The day drinking and the day drugging is out of control.
So, what else would you like to share with our viewers about COVID? I mean, those who got it, those who didn't get it, people who have loved ones who are victims. What else before we go on a short break? We got about 2, 3 minutes again to go on a short break. And I would really like to discuss with you, for the benefit of our viewers, some of your advice and recommendations when it comes to domestic violence. But before we go on the break, is there anything else you would like to share with our viewers about COVID?
I always like to look at the sun so the shadow falls behind. And I think we need to look at the one positive thing COVID did.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's a positive, let's say the rainbow after the rain, is it's really forced people to look at their relationships and themselves and what's important and the value of life. And I think that's a very important lesson. I think the lesson cost us a lot. It cost 500,000 lives. And I think that in order for those lives to be honored and not wasted, we need to look at what we can learn, because every challenge, every tragedy has a lesson. And the lesson really is how valuable life is, and to think about the people and the things in your life that are important, because tomorrow might not come.
You are so right, Dr. Laura. That is so direct to the point, because COVID really created that opportunity for families to have more get together. And I don't mean the non-mask and the mask situation, but families getting more time to be with each other, to communicate, to relate with one another, to build better relationships. Plus, there was even more time talking to friends on the phone, on internet and WhatsApp. Plus, we would not have been talking like this if it was not COVID.
This is a gift, but I think the other thing, and you just, in a positive trigger, you just triggered the thought that I think the other thing that COVID has taught us is the importance of the human connection. That telehealth and telecommunication and Zoom is amazing, and it's a great way to connect. And I think it's, here for the long haul, but it doesn't replace the human connection.
It
And
definitely doesn't.
I think it's, for so long, so many people are spending more time not only on the computer, but on their phone, having relationships on a screen instead of face to face. And when they weren't allowed to see people face to face and the only option was the screen, all of a sudden the screen didn't seem so special anymore.
Wow, that is beautifully put. Now you realize the personal connection, the personal loss, and how very, very, very much it can be when it comes to a loving relationship when you don't have that personal touch. And COVID did teach us that the personal touch is very important when it comes to human beings. Well, Dr. Laura, we have already been talking for more than 15 minutes, so we got to go on a short break. And when we come back, we will touch base a little bit on your expertise, your advice when it comes to domestic violence. And for our viewers out there, we've been talking to Dr. Laura. She's a board-certified expert in traumatic stress, and she is the founder and the president of Dr. Laura's Counseling. Stay tuned. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with her.
Assalamu alaikum. Allah gives hikmat, wisdom, to whomsoever He wills. And whomsoever is given wisdom is certainly given a lot of good. Only the people of understanding will benefit from the reminder. Tune in to Alhikmat TV for khutbahs, lectures, and Islamic reminders. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
In the Quran, in chapter 5, verse 67, Allah tells the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Ya ayyuhar Rasul, balligh ma unzila ilayka min rabbik, wa illam taf'al, fama balagta risalatahu. Very deep. Allah tells the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to spread the message of the Quran. And He told the Prophet, and if you do not spread the message, you did not fulfill the mission of the messenger. So you and I are followers of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If we can afford one Quran, help us join in distributing the Quran. So if you can't afford one Quran, do it. $3. 10 Quran, $30. 100 Quran, $300.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Global Issues on Alhikmat TV 24/7 online. Once more, we are continuing our conversation with Dr. Laura. Dr. Laura, as we said before we went on the short break, she is a board-certified expert in traumatic stress, and she has been on different interviews throughout the United States of America, NBC, ABC, CBS, etc. And we're very fortunate to have her with us on Alhikmat TV. So stay tuned as we continue this conversation with Dr. Laura on domestic violence. So once more, welcome back to the show, Dr. Laura.
Thank you.
Good. So, what would you like to share? Because I think that domestic violence, while it is very rampant and very well known worldwide, there are a lot of people in other parts of the world, as opposed to the United States of America. They don't really have a clue about domestic violence. The only thing that they may probably think is domestic violence is when there is some shootout or some deep physical, bloody relationship. And they may think it's that, but there are a lot of things in the line or the pipeline of domestic violence that can be prevented, or that can be signs of domestic violence, that a person needs to know where they're heading and what's exactly happening to them. Now, in America, because of the lifestyle and the media and all the talk shows, etc., a lot of women are very well equipped and educated when it comes to domestic violence. So, in fact, maybe we want to talk about that also. There's some people who may not be going through domestic violence and they will overreact and make it look like it's domestic violence. You see what I'm saying?
I absolutely see what you're saying. I
Yeah.
think, I was teaching a domestic violence course at Florida Gulf Coast University, and it was to criminal justice students. And one of the things that really was, in my face at the time was the difference between really the legal definition as far as what somebody can get arrested for, the physical violence, the sexual violence, false imprisonment, that kind of thing, and really the clinical or the actual definition of what domestic violence is the different ways that one partner uses to have total control over the other partner, where one partner has all the control. And I use the word partner lightly because it really isn't a partnership, because both people are not equal. One person has all the power and the other person has none.
And we need to make this very clear that when we talk about domestic violence, we are not just talking about men being violent
No.
to women, but both ways.
Years ago, when I've been working in domestic violence for 32 years, and when I first started, it was primarily female victims because of what we call traditional roles and beliefs and that kind of things, gender roles. But gender roles have changed so much, and so has domestic violence, where we're seeing more and more male victims. Years ago, male victims were more afraid to come forward. They were afraid of being ridiculed. Oh, what's the matter? You can't take care of a little woman. But very often women would use knives or cars or, other things. And there really is a lot to be afraid of when one person has all the control and the other person has none, and would use, well, I'll just say that you did this to me or you did that to me. And, when we talk about what it is, we also have to talk about what it isn't. And what it isn't is a leg up in court or manipulation in the relationship. Well, the abuse is the manipulation in the relationship, and that's the abusive partner. But very often people will say they're victims as a way to manipulate the system, which is egregious, because what it does is then it makes it more difficult for true victims who really are in fear of their safety or their life, or really are just so beaten down. There's an expression, victims are beaten down long before they're ever beaten up.
So that brings me to another question. As I said before, a lot of times when we talk about domestic violence, we generally understand it to be women being victims. But you made a fantastic point, and I think that is a beautiful highlight for a discussion on this program, because you don't really hear many people talking about this as what you have just said when it comes to men in recent time being victims. So do you think that can be because of education, because of money, because of career and profession? And what I mean by that is we do see a lot of times nowadays that many a woman got more education than their spouse, than the husband. They got more money than the husband. They got a better job than the husband. They got a better prestige in society than the husband. And I mean, credit goes to the women nowadays who have that kind of achievement and ability. But do you think that can be one of the contributors towards domestic violence, where men become victims of that kind of situation?
I think it can be attributed. I think it can be, one of the things that add to it. I don't think it's the cause. Domestic violence, again, is about complete control. A lot of times, there are role reversals where we have dads that stay home and raise kids and moms that work. And that doesn't necessarily mean that, a stay-at-home dad is, submissive or a victim of domestic violence.
That's a good
I
point.
think the biggest change is that gender roles have changed. I've written a book called Wife Beater Shirt Optional, There Is No Dress Code for Domestic Violence. And it looks at the myths and misperceptions of domestic violence. And I've written it in a gender neutral fashion because we can't say women are the only victims, especially with the younger generation, that gender roles are so fluid and gender identity is changing every day. Years ago, when I started working with victims of domestic violence, there were very traditional gender roles. There were different societal norms as far as what was acceptable and what wasn't. The history of domestic violence, first, they always thought of domestic violence as a family issue. And first they said, well, you can't really be mean to animals. It's not nice to be mean to animals. And then they said, well, maybe you can't be abusive to kids either. And it's only been since the 80s, the 1980s, that they've really started, and it started with men to women, but now, again, we're looking at both sexes where they're saying, maybe it's more than a family issue, and that, a wife doesn't necessarily have to be considered property. Old English common law allowed men to beat their wives as long as the stick they used was no bigger than their thumb.
I like that. That is interesting.
And, a lot of times, again, people focus on physical violence, but there's also emotional violence, which is on your heart, on your feelings, on your self-esteem. There's mental abuse, which the common term now, you see it all over social media, is gaslighting, which is basically crazy making, or when one partner tries to make the other partner think that they're going crazy, based on a movie from the 1940s called Gaslight, driving too fast to frighten or intimidate somebody, manipulating them, coercing them. Sexual violence, people don't know that sexual violence can exist both in intimate partner relationships and in marriages. The destruction of property or pets. A lot of times, victims care more about their pets than they do about themselves. But it's also the message, well, this time it's Rover or Fifi, the next time it could be you. And so it plays into the mental abuse, the financial abuse, the isolation. There's a myth that it can't happen to people of means, but really what they do is cut off all their credit cards or track all their spending with the credit cards. And just because people in a marriage may have financial security, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily easier for them to get out. 70%, by research, in my experience, it's much higher than that, but 70% of victims that get killed in violent relationships get killed when they leave. Because it's about the power and control. And when the victim takes the control back, that's when the abusive partner says, if I can't have you, nobody will, or I love you to death. And that's when it's the most dangerous. So safety planning needs to happen before a victim stays. And so often we hear, why does he or she stay? Why don't they leave? Sometimes in the short run, it's easier to stay than to leave. And interestingly enough, again, we talk about victim blaming and victim shaming. Everybody talks about why the victim stays, but how often do you hear, why does he or she batter their partner? People don't ask that question. They only ask why the person stays. They don't ask why the egregious behavior is happening.
So that brings me to another point. Wonderfully said. Fantastic. That's why you're an expert on this kind of discussion and topic. I see why you are a board certified expert in traumatic stress and an expert in domestic violence. So we can, therefore, based on what you have said, we can also, and I would love you to share your opinion on this also, we can probably say that ignorance can be a reason for domestic violence, or a contributor, because a man can have a wife who is not educated, not wealthy, doesn't have a profession, and vice versa. A woman got a husband who is not educated, not wealthy, doesn't have a career and profession, but just that ignorance of not having tolerance and not being compatible to the spouse can make them very violent against each other. And that can be a very stressful situation and can end up having the other spouse as a victim.
Well, I've got to challenge your saying not compatible. I think that's a very dangerous perception. I agree with.
Share your opinion. That's why I'm talking about it. I want to hear your
I
perspective.
think the ignorance. I have a girlfriend that always says, you don't know what you don't know. And a lot of times people think they do know and they do understand, which is really why they don't understand, because they're not willing to learn, because they think they already know. They think that domestic violence looks a certain way and they don't meet that criteria, so it doesn't count. I've worked with a number of victims that have said to me, I wish he would just hit me, then I would know I was being abused. The idea that a victim has the stigma of victimization. So you see somebody that's very educated or that's very wealthy or that comes from, let me put my coffee down so I can do the quotes, comes from a good family, and all these myths or misperceptions that it can't happen to me. It must be to somebody else. The reason I called the book Wife Beater Shirt Optional is because I worked with a woman who made $100,000 a year, and her husband also made a nice living. And I was talking about the abuse in the relationship and said something about domestic violence, and she said to me, Laura, I'm not one of those women. I said, well, what do you mean? She says, they live in trailer parks and their husbands wear wife beater shirts. I said, oh, I didn't know there was a dress code for domestic violence. And I was so upset for so long because I thought she was being judgmental. But then I realized it was me that didn't get it, because she wasn't judging that. That's really what she thought. She misperceived what it looked like because that's the way that it had been explained to her. So she was sure she must be doing something wrong, because things like that don't happen to women like her. They only happen to those people. But, again, something else COVID taught us is there is no us and them. Anybody can be one trauma away from a totally different life.
Interesting.
But the last thing that I want to add, when we were talking about domestic violence and you talk about traditional roles and, one partner perhaps being more submissive than the other, I think that the critical term here is free will. If that's what both partners want and they're both happy and they like the roles and the rules that the way that they are, then that's not domestic violence. It's where one person has all the power and the other person wants to have a voice or is afraid but isn't allowed to have a voice. Where one person, it's I pay, I say, and they don't have access to very often to family members, to a peer support group, to any kind of connection. So the only person they have to hold on to is their partner.
Interesting. That is interesting. Well, Dr. Laura, we have already spoken for 15 minutes in the second segment, so we got to go on a short break. And when we come back, I would like you to share with our viewers some of the books that you have written. It's interesting. They can go and check it out. They can buy the books. They can read up and learn more about your knowledge, your experience, your expertise, your advice, and how they can benefit. So when we come back, we'll continue this conversation a little more on domestic violence and sexual violence, etc. So for viewers there who have just tuned in, we have been talking to Dr. Laura. She is an expert on traumatic stress, and she's also the president of Dr. Laura Counseling, and I suppose that means you can give her a call and you can make the necessary arrangement for counseling and consultation as the case may be. So stay tuned. When we come back, we'll continue this conversation with Dr. Laura.
Assalamu alaikum. Allah gives hikmat, wisdom, to whomsoever He wills. And whomsoever is given wisdom is certainly given a lot of good. Only the people of understanding will benefit from the reminder. Tune in to Alhikmat TV for khutbahs, lectures, and Islamic reminders. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
In the Quran, in chapter 5, verse 67, Allah tells the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Ya ayyuhar Rasul, balligh ma unzila ilayka min rabbik, wa illam taf'al, fama balagta risalatahu. Very deep. Allah tells the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to spread the message of the Quran. And he told the Prophet, and if you do not spread the message, you did not fulfill the mission of the messenger. So you and I are followers of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If we can afford one Quran, help us join in distributing the Quran. So if you can't afford one Quran, do it. $3. 10 Quran, $30. 100 Quran, $300.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Global Issues on Alhikmat TV 24/7 online. Once more, it is a pleasure to have with us on today's program Dr. Laura, who is an expert, board certified traumatic stress expert. However we want to put it, she is the president and the owner of Dr. Laura's Counseling. She's a woman who is very well experienced in this field. She's given a lot of advice, has appeared on CBS, ABC, NBC, etc. And hence, we're very fortunate to have her on Alhikmat TV. Welcome back to the show, Dr. Laura.
Thank you.
Good. So as we were saying in the conversation before we went on the break, I want to continue an issue on that. Based on domestic violence and happening both ways, and definitely we know that the majority of victims are women if we look at what's going on. Am I correct?
I think traditionally the majority of victims have been women. I think with people that are older, I think the majority probably still are women. Again, with some of the younger generation where the gender roles are so different, a little less traditional, as we'll say, I think we're seeing more and more male victims.
So we are almost 50-50?
I think it's important because working in domestic violence, again, over 30 years, the perception, or I should say the misperception, of people that worked in domestic violence, those of us that we were all a bunch of, man-hating lesbians, which is so far from the truth. The word hate is pretty strong, and it's really the violence that's unacceptable, and certainly not men. I mean, there are a lot of really good men out there. But I think knowing that again, domestic violence doesn't have a certain face. So we have to know that anybody can be a victim, and to look at every situation and every partnership differently and within the confines of that relationship, and not just look at the gender, but look at the situation. We see it a lot with gay and lesbian relationships where traditionally they were thought, we used to call it the double closet. They were thought to be either just a cat fight or, two guys having a brawl. But intimate partner violence is intimate partner violence, whether people are the same sex or different sex.
So, talking about the rise in male victims in nowadays time with the younger generations as opposed, and that's a very, very, very powerful statement you made, that traditionally women were the majority, basically, generally speaking, the majority of victims in domestic violence. But in recent times with the younger generation, it's men. Now, that brings me to another point of crime and murder. All right, crime, murder, violence, yeah, people know it's a slap, it's a beat, it's a fight, it's a beater, wife beater, husband beater, whatever it may be. But that brings me to the point of crime. What do you have to say about crime in the world?
Interestingly enough, and I don't blame the media, but I think the media needs some education here, because very often it's called domestic violence until it's a murder, and then they call it murder, they don't call it domestic violence.
Yeah, I like that point. And I have always wondered because, in my profession, we do a lot of counseling. We do a lot of counseling before marriages and do counseling for people. And you made a fantastic point there, Dr. Laura. And the media needs to be just and not be fake. They need to speak the truth. A lot of times you hear of a murder, you hear of a crime. And I have spoken to people in different countries throughout the world on crime. And many a times the crime, as opposed to theft and, this kind of murder, a lot of times, dear, murder is because one spouse caused or paid someone or was behind the murder of the next spouse. And the media comes up and says it's just a crime and does not say what was the reason behind it. And here you have this triangle love situation, this sort of hidden love, and someone pays someone off to murder somebody. It was not, it was not like stealing, it was not theft, it was just shoot and disappear. And if you would really track the history of that, it's a spouse that was behind that murder.
Well, and I think very often, in investigations, the spouse is always the first person that they look at. Again, it's that if I can't have you, nobody will, and it's really looking and calling it what it is, that it's a domestic violence murder or domestic violence homicide, and not just a murder. I shouldn't say just murder, because murder is murder, but it's not a stranger or somebody in the community. The person that's doing the murdering is the person that the victim loved and trusted, the person that was supposed to keep them safe, very often the person that they had a child or children with that took their life. Mm-hmm. And that's very significant. And I think it's also important for people to see how often it happens, because it happens much more often than people realize. And people think when we talk about, domestic violence murder, that, that hardly ever happens, or you're catastrophizing or being a drama queen. But the truth is, it happens much more often than people realize, and it's happening more and more often.
That makes so much sense, and I really, really agree with you that the media needs to be honest with the viewers, because when it comes to a robbery, you hear about a robbery and crime and murder. You always hear about drugs and murder, but when it comes to violence and domestic violence, they do not. I mean, I know they cannot analyze the situation and jump to a conclusion, but just as they attach robbery and drugs at some point in time to a murder case, they should, because that may be a form of education to spouses, that they will be exposed and very much exposed, not just the lawyers and the court, and it's a hidden thing that the husband was behind the wife's murder or the wife was behind her husband's murder. But people need to be educated about this, because this domestic violence will just continue growing.
I think that's a really important point, and with the education, and I don't think the media is being dishonest. I think when somebody's killed, then they call it a murder. And again, you know, when you know better, you do better, and you call it a murder, it is a murder.
It is a murder, yes.
They're just not, you know, it's just, you know, like Paul Harvey used to say, you need the rest of the story. You know, and very often, you know, explaining and maybe doing some education with domestic violence and murder and how things escalate and, you know, how that happens.
So the media is not dishonest, but they're just not telling us everything. I think that's a way to go, because I mean, from an educational point of view, I'm just saying that because I have seen and I've heard of a lot of these murder cases, and because of counseling and all these things, and when you're contacted, I was able to realize that it had something from a domestic line. Maybe the spouse did not commit the murder directly, but was very influential in the setup. And that's very sad. That's very sad. But anyhow,
Well, I think it's very sad. But the, you know, the other thing, until people have all the facts or until it's tried in court, you also have to be very careful, you know, what you say, you know, unless you're 100% sure, because you don't want, you know, the current situation or the media or public perception to interfere with the potential for a just hearing.
well, that's correct, and you're totally correct. And those are the technicalities in investigation and crime and murder, etc. Otherwise, it may just lead to more crime and more
Right.
murder.
Well, and I would like to share, when we talk about education, the book you mentioned, I've written, it's called Wife Beater Shirt Optional. There is no dress code for domestic violence. And for people that may not know, these white t-shirts that I mentioned in the prior story that the woman referred to, they call them wife beater shirts, which is really a very horrible name for them. In the back of the book, I don't know if you can see, I have a woman in a wife beater. And, you know, the idea, again, it's about the myths and misconceptions. It doesn't look a certain way. The reason that I have no heads and they're cut off at the neck is because it can be anybody. And I didn't want people to look at a certain face and say, that's what it looks like. Because
So that book is written by you, Dr. Laura. The name of the book is Wife Beater
Wife
Shirt.
beater shirt optional. There is no dress code for domestic violence.
That is interesting. Well, Dr.
And
Laura,
it's available on Amazon.
Dr.
You
Laura,
download it on Amazon today.
Dr. Laura, I have surely learned something. I never knew that t-shirt was called a wife beater. That is interesting. So we need to advise men, do not wear that shirt and go out of the house, because a lot of people may just think that you are a wife beater. But that's a fantastic book, and I think our viewers should surely go on Amazon and get a copy of your book, The Wife Beater Shirt by Dr. Laura. Before we conclude the show today, Dr. Laura, we got a couple minutes again, 2 or 3 minutes. What would you like to share with our viewers pertaining to sexual violence?
Oh, it's kind of a very open question. As far as sexual violence, anybody that I've ever worked with that's been a victim of sexual violence always says that they feel broken or dirty or damaged. And the fact is, just because something bad happened to you, it doesn't make you a bad person or a broken person or a damaged person. It makes you a traumatized person that needs to heal. And it's really difficult going to talk to somebody. But by not talking to somebody and working through it, you're giving the person that abused you or that hurt you the power to continue to hurt you. And they don't deserve that power. when the Me Too movement came out, one of the things they found was the average age of sexual violence, adult survivors of sexual violence as children, the average age of them reporting was 52 years old. That just
Wow.
now people are feeling safe enough to talk about it, especially where there was family violence. We always hear about, Uncle Al or Cousin Charlie or, a parent or a step parent, but there's so much sibling violence, sexual violence. Only 3% of sexual violence is stranger violence. And it's very difficult to report when it's somebody that you know or somebody that you love or are supposed to trust or afraid of the consequences of what will happen, that you'll not be able to stay with your family, or that there will be repercussions. I think people really underestimate the reasons why people don't tell. And just because they don't tell doesn't mean it didn't happen. And just because they finally feel safe after somebody has a stroke or they die or whatever, and then they share it, doesn't mean that they're making it up. It just means that it didn't feel safe enough to talk about, and they got to a point in their life that the only thing worse than talking about it was not talking about it, and that they couldn't hold it in anymore.
So I think that our viewers out there who are viewing this program from different countries worldwide, you as an expert on sexual violence and domestic violence, you're a qualified expert on these matters. Would you like to share your website or wherever that people can contact you after listening to this show, after hearing your comments and your advice on this show? How can people get in contact with you? With social media nowadays, the globe has become very, very small. So people would definitely want to contact you and consult you on certain matters of these areas. What would you like to share with our audience?
My website is Dr. Laura, Dr. Laura, Laura, at Dr. Laura Counseling, COUNSELING.com. And I will, in the next couple months, I will also be starting some counseling and treatment through Atlas Healthcare. They can contact me through there. Unfortunately, off the top of my head, I don't know the website.
Well, I suppose as long as they get in contact with you, Dr. Laura Counseling, your website will have some connection to Atlas, and it's Atlas Immigration Foundation. So they can go on to Atlas Immigration Foundation and they'll find you there to communicate on whatever expertise advice you can share, and on your website. So, well, we have reached the end of the program. You got a couple of seconds that you can conclude the show with. Tell us.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for the opportunity. It's absolutely been a pleasure to speak with you and to talk to your community. And if some of the information helped one person, then it was worth it.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Laura. I did learn a lot from you. I did learn a lot sitting, talking to you. And that's one of the reasons for this talk show, that we learn from others, and viewers worldwide are motivated and they're able to learn from these kind of discussions, and it's under the level of education, motivation, etc. So thank you very much once more for taking the time as a busy person with your schedule. Thank you very much for taking the time to be on our show on Global Issues on Alhikmat TV, and we do hope that you can come back another time so we can discuss some other issues.
I would love to.
It will be our pleasure, our pleasure to have you back to talk a little more in details on some other issues. Thank you very much, Dr. Laura. And for viewers out there, we have been speaking to Dr. Laura. She is the president and the founder of Dr. Laura's Counseling. She's a board-certified expert in traumatic stress. She has appeared on ABC, CBS, NBC. She's an expert on these areas of trauma, stress, domestic violence, sexual violence, etc. So feel free to contact her on her website, Dr. Laura, drlauracounseling.com, and feel free to benefit from her knowledge and her experience. Until then, always stay tuned to Alhikmat TV 24/7 online. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.